Every year in the garden, you're going to get things that go right, you're going to get things that go wrong. And that's what I'm talking about today. 5 of the things that I got wrong in my garden that I've learned from, and hopefully you'll be able to learn from too. But before we get into just the bad things, let's highlight some of the really big wins this year. The first one is okra. At one point, I harvested at least 70 pods just from this raised garden bed right here. Actually, I was only growing half of it. I had so much I honestly didn't really know what to do with all of it, which will actually lead to one of my points later on about improvements to make. And the same thing with eggplant. I'm actually still growing it now in December. I have one right here. I've been harvesting eggplant for over 3 months now, so it was one of the most successful crops that I grew this year, and definitely want to bring back next year. But again, a lesson learned from that. Other than that, I grew pepper from seeds this year, which I honestly didn't think I would have the patience for, but I did, and I was able to harvest them and enjoy them, and it's something I'm without a doubt going to be doing again this coming growing season. And then lastly, I did a really good job at Pest Defense. If you saw some of our earlier videos this beginning of this year, you would have seen that we put down a thinner gauge or a smaller gauge gopher wire to prevent animals from burrowing up inside of our garden beds. And if you have been paying close attention, you'll also notice that we have little reflective pinwheels throughout all of our garden beds. And the reason being is that they move around a lot with wind and light reflects off of them, which is honestly really good at keeping birds and other pests away from our plants and our harvests. And along with those gardening successes, there of course were failures or things I wish I had done differently or a little bit better. And I'm going to go ahead and take you through 5 of the main ones. And if you're enjoying our gardening content, show that like button some love, subscribe, follow, and let's continue to garden together. So the first thing that I wish I had done a little bit differently this year was stagger planting. If you've watched any of our prior videos about planting, you'll know that we talk about stagger planting pretty often. And basically stagger planting is just the process of planting some of one crop at one point, waiting a week or so, planting more of it, and so on. That way you can harvest it periodically over time instead of all at once. And I did that with our okra and our eggplant, but I underestimated the amount of harvest that we'd actually get out of it. So if I were to do it differently this year, I would actually wait about 2 to 3 weeks before each of my plantings. That way I'm not harvesting everything all at once. At one point, I think I harvested 73 okra pods, which is wonderful, but I mean, it's a lot to use at once. And with eggplant, I've been harvesting it now for 3 months, so the stagger planting worked fairly well. But at one point, I harvested 14 eggplant in one day, which is way more than my family and I can enjoy in the amount of time that the eggplant is still okay to eat and isn't starting to kind of shrivel up. So a lot of friends got eggplant and okra this year, which isn't a bad thing, but if I were to do it differently, I would space out my stagger planting a little bit further. That way I can enjoy the harvest a bit more. The next thing I'm going to do is let go of plants that just aren't going to make it. There's nothing wrong with trying to nurse plants back to health or take better care of them to hopefully make them healthier, but after a while they're a little too far gone, and that happened with a couple of our tomatoes this year. I kept trying to bring them back, but it just was too much, and they weren't really growing how they normally should, and they were kind of sickly, and really just dealing with a fungal issue that unfortunately just was too much for me to overcome. So instead of me keeping that plant and occupying space in my garden longer than it really needs to, I need to do a better job of letting go, taking out those plants that aren't really healthy, and being able to use that garden space more enjoyably with plants that will grow. Third thing that I would do differently is adapt to my environment a little bit sooner. Over the summer, we put up shade cloth over our garden to basically break up the really intense Florida sun from cooking our plants too much. And the reason we put it up this time was because this was the first year that we had less shade from neighboring trees that typically had overhang and would essentially buffer out that sun in the summer for us. We had those trees trimmed back, and so adapting to our first summer without having those trees casting too much shadow was something that we weren't entirely sure how to time. So what I would have done is put the shade cloth up a little bit sooner now that I know how much sun this garden is getting, and that should have helped some of our plants do a little bit better in this intense Florida heat. The fourth thing I would do differently is mulch my garden a little bit sooner. Again, with that summer heat here in Florida and really a lot of places across the US in the summer, having too much sun on your soil is not really a great thing. If it heats up too much, it can really reduce your microbe activity, which is what essentially breaks down your soil and creates more nutrients for your plants to absorb. Now, if you have plants that have a really good canopy, that of course protects your soil from the harsh sun, and you could also have a cover like we had later on in the summer to block out some of that intensity on the soil as well. But if I'm gonna mulch again, I wanna do it a little bit sooner because it'll give me a little bit of added protection, and will give me a little bit more reassurance in case our Florida sun is a little too intense. And the fifth thing that I want to do a little bit differently this year is starting to use natural fungicides and insecticides within my garden. And typically what I've done in the past is use soil solarization or spraying bugs off or removing colonies I see on leaves and things like that. And that's great, but it's pretty time consuming, and especially with soil solarization, it takes up a lot of planting time that, otherwise I could be growing something. So with an ongoing maintenance of something like a BT or neem oil, that should be helpful in allowing me to grow more and enjoy my plants more, and of course fight off all the pests and issues that you have in a very humid climate like Florida. I mean, in Florida we have funguses, molds, bugs, lizards, alligators. On a side note, if anyone has a story about an alligator getting into the garden, please send it to me. I really want to read that. And with all these different pests and possible ailments, being in a hot, humid climate, I want to be able to protect my garden a little bit better and enjoy more time of it without having to rely on, less effective or less time-sensitive methods. And lastly, along with the wins and the 5 things that I would do differently this coming year in the garden, there's a bunch of things that I'm pretty excited about in our garden this year. The first one is that we're going to be expanding this garden area to have more garden beds and grow a variety of new plants that we haven't shown on our channel before. On top of that, we're also, in a very short amount of time, going to be introducing new Garden Minutes products that a lot of you have actually been asking me about. So keep an eye on that. So if you're not already, like, subscribe, follow, all the things, and let's grow your best garden together.